Thank you so much, Your Excellency. How many interesting things that you said about the relations between the two countries. Now, time has come to introduce our first panel session, where together with a set of prominent authorities, we will discuss about geopolitics and business, the changing geopolitical scene and new patterns in supply chain. We have the great honor to have with us today as our first speaker, Anders Ahnlid, Director General of the Swedish National Board of Trade, with extensive experience in various diplomatic roles. Having also served as a negotiator in the GATT Uruguay round that led to the creation of the World Trade Organization, Mr. Ahnlid is a recognized expert in matters of international trade policy. Mr. Ahnlid, please welcome to our business forum. It's a true honor to have you with us today. Take your seat. Our second speaker, Nikos Tsafos, is the Chief Energy Advisor to the Prime Minister of Greece. A leading authority on energy, Mr. Tsafos has worked with companies, banks, and governments in over 30 countries on some of the world's most complex energy projects. Mr. Tsafos is an internationally sought-after expert who, among his other activities, and he has a lot, regularly contributes as a commentator on energy and geopolitics-related issues to prestigious international media outlets such as the Bloomberg, CNN, The Economist, BBC, and so on. Welcome, Mr. Tsafos. Please come on stage. Thank you for being here today with us. Our third speaker, Dr. Nikos Vettas, who will join us just with a few minutes of delay because we rearranged the program a bit, but I will introduce him now, is the Director General of the Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research, IOVE, since 2013, and he is also a Professor of Economics at the Athens University of Economics and Business since 2003. He holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and has an impressive international academic and research background. Mr. Vettas is a prominent figure in the field of industrial economics and economic policy, and he sits at various relevant committees, commissions, and advisory groups, both at European and at Greek level. Last but not least, we have another one. We are delighted to have this session moderated by Vasilis Antoniades, Senior Partner and Managing Director at Boston Consulting Group, Greece. Mr. Antoniades is also the East Mediterranean and Caspian Financial Institutions Practice Leader of BCG, and he's also a member of the BCG Global CEO Advisory Board. He's a trusted advisor to financial institutions, energy players, governments, and organizations across Europe and the Middle East. Mr. Antoniades, please welcome on stage. I hand you over the control so you may start the session.
Hello. Thank you very much, Maria. And it's a true honor to be invited again at the Swedish-Greek Chamber conference. And I would like to thank John Sarakakis and the Chamber for the invitation. I had the honor to be at the inaugural conference back in 2015, a very different context for Greece and for the world in many respects. And it is also a great honor. In fact, I'm very thrilled to be leading this panel, having Ambassador Ahnlid, who among his track record has also served as ambassador to Finland, which is also back in the geopolitical discussion, and Nikos Tsafos, whom we had the pleasure to collaborate in the past in the energy sector, and soon Nikos Vettas in an old partnership that we've had with the IOVE and the Boston Consulting Group. The topic is not a light one. It's about geopolitics in the year 2023 in a very different world, as I have already mentioned. I think that when we talk about geopolitics, what is very important is to consider what are the big axis of change that we have seen over the last years, and we are talking about only the last 3 to 4 years, which is really signifying the amount of change in a very short period of time. And of course, we only start with COVID-19 and what the outbreak has meant to many countries, the lockdowns that were imposed at a period of time when economies were put at a halt, resulted in a severe global economic downturn in 2020. And after 3 years, one would like to say that this is behind us, but the reality is that we have new variants emerging from the vaccine inequity, which leaves high-income countries having about 3 out of 4 people vaccinated. In low-income countries, the vaccination is 1 out of 3 according to the World Health Organization, which means that it is far from being behind us, and I think we see it also in our everyday lives. Then there is what has already been mentioned, the sadness of the tragic Ukraine war, when Russia's decision to invade the Ukraine back in February 2022 had an unprecedented impact across multiple dimensions. Supply chains put at risk, commodity shortages on basic goods, component and product sourcing challenges, and soaring prices and the resulting inflation. The reliance of EU countries on Russian gas resulted into an energy crisis, and finally, and most importantly, in this war, it's the humanitarian aspect and the 6 million refugees. If one looks at the silver lining, and I would ask in all our presentations and the discussion that despite the tragedy, we look at what could give us hope and the half full glass, is that the Western allies are coming closer, and I think the Swedish and the Finnish membership candidacy for NATO is a great example of that. I think that's something that certainly strengthens the Western alliance. On the other side, we see also the BRICS forming another front, which poses more questions. We spoke about Russia, Ukraine, but there is also another emerging rift, unfortunately, which could come as a big surprise if one looks at it in retrospect. Many years ago, we were talking about China emerging as one of the world's global largest economy, surpassing the US, and there were bets as early as 2030. There is a slowdown in the China economy, but I think most importantly what we see is the decoupling of the West versus China, the impact that this has on technology, but on many, many other fronts, including the security and more broadly the geopolitical challenges that this faces. I know I'm not being very light in my introduction, and just to make it also a little bit heavier, I have not forgotten the most important crisis of our times, which is the climate change, the climate crisis, which we live very, very strongly in this country. And yes, there is always the COP27 target of decrease by 1.5, but on one side we see support, on the other side progress is far from where it should be. Finally, and I could not close without reflecting on the sadness, as was mentioned in the introduction, from the unprecedented terrorist attack of Hamas on Israel and the resulting war that we live through every day, and all the turbulence that this brings back to the Middle East. And from what we see, it would be very difficult to see any end in the near future. We will be having some great perspectives, starting the perspective of Anders Ahnlid, who will be sharing with us as Director General of National Board of Trade in Sweden, his view on the turbulent outlook for international trade, but also his urge for the need for a continued trade policy and the need for a strengthening of the trade ties, not only between Sweden and Greece, but globally. Then we will be hearing from Nikos Tsafos as the Chief Energy Advisor to the Prime Minister of Greece. And the last presentation will be by Nikos Vettas on the evolving landscape for global trade and investments and the implications on the Greek economy. I would like to ask each of the presenters to keep the time of 15 minutes because we would also enjoy very much a discussion following your presentations around some key topics, in which I would also invite the audience to open up with their questions as well. So, Ambassador Ahnlid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vasilis, for that thorough introduction. And it is a great pleasure, privilege, and joy for me to be here and address this forum and this august group of Swedish-Greek trade doers. I represent the National Board of Trade. And the National Board of Trade is Sweden's agency, Sweden's government's agency for international trade, EU internal market, and trade policy. We have been around since 1651. I do not intend to go that long back in history, but I think in order to reflect on where we are today in the global system, as Vasilis mentioned, and the challenges we have in the global system, it is worthwhile to look back a little bit at least. The kind of globalization that we were used to for a couple of decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, is no more. That is evident. And in a way, that is not a good thing. Globalization has lifted millions of people out from poverty around the globe in a very positive way throughout these decades. Now, probably, when we look back in economic history, we will find that the kind of globalization we saw from the 1990s and onwards probably has been and is a parenthesis in history. We see again today that security policy is more and more inflicting on, if I may say so, or putting its traces on other types of policies, including trade policy. I think it might be worthwhile reflecting on the fact that that is nothing new. After the Second World War, the United States built the global trading system with allies in making sure that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that Greece acceded to in 1950 and Sweden in 1951 became a club of countries integrated, trading together in a way that led to prosperity and in a way that made the Soviet bloc kept behind. You could argue that the success of the global trading system as built by the Americans after the Second World War was part of the explanation for why the Soviet bloc imploded and why we got the end of the Cold War. At that time, the heydays of globalization, we also saw the most far-reaching global trading negotiation ever taking place. The GET round that was alluded to earlier, where I started my career, so I'm an old-timer in this respect. But again, tremendous results were created in that negotiation. Vast liberalization of industrial products. Agricultural trade was for the first time put under global trading rules and liberalized. Same for textiles, which was important for many countries. New rules for services, intellectual property rights, investments, and a binding dispute settlement system. All this was set up during the heydays of globalization when the World Trade Organization came about in 1995. Today, as you know, the WTO has 164 members. Decisions are taken by consensus in that organization, and that explains partly why it is no longer very efficient. But these these grand days of globalization didn't last for long. There were protests against what was done in the World Trade Organization. Some of you might recall the havoc in Genoa at the G7 meeting, WTO meeting in Seattle, riots on the streets, an EU meeting in Gothenburg, riots on the streets. So there were plenty of views against the kind of globalization that was created. But again, security-related facts intervened. After 9/11, the atrocities of 9/11, the global community again thought it would try again to push the global system forward, and we got the Doha round of trade negotiations going. It went on for a while, collapsed in 2008, and that, I would argue, is the end point of globalization as it used to be in the old past days. Since then, the global trading system has basically not evolved. Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history during this period. Of course, history wasn't dead, and we have seen that in many ways in recent time, as we have heard. So, the start of the fragmentation of the global trading system. Jagdish Bhagwati, the American economist, said that this was a spaghetti bowl of trade agreement around the world. And if one looks at that picture, one sees why that was the case. So that has been the avenue forward since then. Bilateral, regional negotiations. The US participated at first. The EU has been good in forging such agreements and arrangements, and that's positive. And with the Great Recession that broke out 2008, with the severe times, not least for Europe and Greece, there was an attempt, as you know, to clinch a global bilateral trade deal between the EU and the United States that failed and was abolished under the Trump years in the United States. Evident that the global changes in the structure of power is behind this. You see China's rise if you measure power in terms of share of world exports. The United States going down, the EU flat, and this, of course, we know in global system leads to conflict and difficulties. And that is, I think, what we have been seeing lately. We have heard a lot already about the pandemic and what it meant for difficulties for traders as you. I would also say that despite problems at the beginning of the pandemic, we also saw that EU rules, global rules, actually saved us during the pandemic. It was thanks to a still fairly robust global trading system that both protective gear and not least the vaccine could be produced and distributed. So positive aspects from trade in that respect as well. The war in Ukraine and now the horrific conflict in the Middle East, of course, has affected the system very much as well. Interesting, I think, to note is that Russia exceeded the WTO in 2012 without much change being made to that country. And we also know, of course, what happened from 2014 and onwards and what the atrocities in Ukraine have meant for the global trading system. But it has also forged the Western alliance, and I think that is good. We've heard about Sweden's and Finland's NATO accession, and hopefully soon Swedish NATO accession. It is, in my view, a negative that this new era of transatlantic unity has not spilled over to trade yet, because we see that the United States is no longer a champion of free trade, and there are many reasons for that that I don't need to go into. But the United States is no longer seeking free trade solutions, neither in the WTO nor bilaterally. Instead, the main objective of the United States is to keep China at bay through various means. And China, of course, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty thanks to China's integration in the trading system since 2001, when China was given accession to the World Trade Organization. But it's also equally evident that China is not a country that fits under the global trading rules, given its state capitalism and the Communist Party's way of looking at how trade and production should be done. So clear challenges there, in particular for our European Union, which now has to try to find out how to handle this situation, this new landscape. Evidently, and that's important, there are important American examples to follow, not least when it comes to how to handle the real security-related problems with China and the real trade distortive aspects of Chinese behavior around the globe. And we are doing that. The Commission is now about to set up a new economic security strategy, which will include more action on both inward and outward investment screening, and also attempts to have a more unified European export control system. This is all important, but equally important for resilience and for the future is that the EU continues to push for free trade agreements with allies and with trusted partners. And I would argue that it's equally important that despite difficulties in the WTO, the EU needs also to push for and promote the WTO as a framework for global trade, also in these difficult times. That's important for trading countries like Greece and Sweden and the EU, but also and not least for a number of developing countries around the world. The future ain't what it used to be, that's for sure. I don't know how many of you who know the American late baseball player Yogi Berra, who is said to have said this once. And it is a new trade landscape that we are now seeing. New instruments are being set up in terms of how to cooperate on trade. We have the Trade and Technology Council with the United States. That's important, but it has so far not given any trace of new trade openings. We are trying with the Americans to make sure that we don't have to reinstate the tariffs on steel and aluminum, and that's difficult. And the EU has to continue to push in these directions. And the question, of course, is to what extent we will see a future where the EU pursues strategic autonomy, or whether we are able to pursue open strategic economy, which of course is the solution we want to see from the Swedish, and I learned today also, happily so, from a Greek point of view. I will finish by saying that much has changed. There are also things that haven't changed. The need to make sure that we reap the benefits from trade, and we know that open trade delivers welfare to our countries if correctly handled. We know that economic integration still works even if we can't pursue integration with countries like China and Russia anymore. We know that Ricardo's theory of comparative advantages still functions, and modern trade theory has shown that the gains from trade are probably larger than we thought before, given that openness for trade makes firms more productive than otherwise. And that is a key finding of recent economic research. If you're interested in this, you see here a link to a publication that the National Board of Trade has published, and that you are welcome to find on our web page. How is this happening? A key factor is imports. And we often forget that, of course, politicians like to see exports flourishing. It's equally important to have a functioning import regime for the EU, for our countries. And it's through such a thing that we can do better when it comes to also become good exporters. We see how imports make companies more productive, trade, foreign direct investment make those companies more productive, and we have better access to intermediary goods and what have you. So many factors of this sort are important. And of course, also increased access to other markets makes our countries' economies more productive and competitive. There are a number of examples that can be referred to. If one looks at Swedish firms that trade, generally speaking, they have 48% higher labor productivity and pay 44% higher wages than firms that do not engage in trade and have international links of that sort. There are many challenges ahead, not least when it comes to figuring out with whom to forge new and more open trade conditions. We have to be careful not to enter into difficulties with our security. That's key in relation to countries like Russia and China. But all in all, many possible opportunities still ahead, including for Swedish and Greek traders. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Impressed with the sharpness on time. Not surprising, given the Swedish nationality. And also very excited about the positive tone around the fact that the chronicles on the death of globalization are grossly exaggerated, the renewed focus on free trade agreements and the support for the World Trade Organization. The new vocabulary, securitization, has entered the global lingo in a new context around security rather than the financial markets and strategic autonomy, and also the positive note on importance of trade and the importance of imports as much as exports. So I think it's setting the tone in a very constructive way to ask Nikos Vettas, Director General of EOVE, Greece's preeminent think tank, to share his presentation on the evolving landscape of global trade and investments and its implications for the Greek economy. Thank you, Nico.
Okay, thank you, Vasily. Thanks to the organizers. It's really an honor to be here and try to share some thoughts. Contrary to the previous speaker, Vasily, I'm Greek, so you have to help me with the time to be equally sharp. Okay, before I get to my slides, some general thoughts. And before we go to Greece, what has shaped modern businesses and what has shaped modern economies and what has shaped our way of understanding what economies are is a trend that started in the early 80s. The early 80s, as you all know, was just after the 70s, and the 70s was a time of oil shocks and war. Starting in the 80s, there was about 3 decades of increased global trade, integration of all sorts of economies. When I'm saying all sorts of economies, what we used to call the Western world, then China, then the collapse of all the Soviet bloc, and an increase in productivity driven primarily by the gradual integration of computers into production. It's really hard to even imagine how many things were happening in 1980 relative to how we do things today. All this gave support to increased incomes globally and in a sustainable manner for a really long time. And we took this for granted without questioning whether a lot of these forces could continue forever. The first signs of this fatigue actually happened in around early to mid-year 2000. And that's when we also started seeing an increase in global debt. Debt that was necessary to support standards of living, despite the fact that productivity was not increasing as much. Standing now in 2023, it's hard to predict how things are going to be 10 years from now. We have lots of questions. And these questions become really fundamental. If global trade is to actually retract, what does this mean for the division of labor globally? We had these reservoirs of free energy, of very cheap energy. For Europe, this was Russia. That's gone. We benefited from decades of free labor, very cheap labor, I should say, in Southeastern Asia and China. That it's either gone or will be gone 10 years from now. And if we're not going to have a lot of trade, but we are going to have more production closer to home, in fact, for Greece, people say this is a great opportunity, that European businesses and European economies would like not to import from half the way around the world, but instead look for greater assurance of supply closer to home, and that may mean Greece, the periphery of the Eurozone. But if that's true, and to a certain extent it is, it also means higher costs. If you talk to most people, the first thing they tell you is risk off. That's the world that we are entering. And if you are in a world where you have to face risks, this necessarily means that the costs are going to be higher. So looking in the next 10 years ahead, it's going to be, on average, higher energy costs, on average, higher capital costs, and supply chains are not going to run as smooth as they did in the past. Having said all that, and now let me get to some slides, the rumors for the death of globalization, as was also previously explained, are greatly exaggerated. So that's also what happened to global trade, according to one of the main indices. So lots of people were telling you, this is April of 2020, so just before, you know, this was the heat of COVID. And after that, we went not back, we didn't just go back, we went higher than back. Okay, so that's one. Now, of course, this hides a lot of changes in the composition. However, global trade is still there. The other thing that we saw is how this is reflected in capital markets, which have not suffered. The Americans had actually seem not to have cared much for COVID. They seem not to have cared much for their president, suggesting that global trade is not such a good thing. They didn't seem to care much about Brexit. Of course, the high energy prices following the Russian invasion into Ukraine was bad news for the markets, but even that seems like the global markets did not much care about, although we didn't see not everyone saw this the same way. You see on the right the different implications for the European currency and the American currency, which has gone up. This is sentiment indicators on the left, which again, they show COVID, it happened, then we felt much, much better after COVID. In fact, there is a story that is hidden here, which is a very interesting story, which is that humans, especially Europeans, after they were locked in at home and they were told you cannot go out, post-COVID, we measure a higher propensity to consume at every level. People got a little bit more short-sighted. They said, I'm not willing to save that much in order to consume in 10 years, because who knows how things are going to be in 10 years. So people are consuming a lot more, especially services, not so much products. Then you can make a story about energy costs. None of the stories, none of the pictures I'm showing you are consistent, either with the collapse of global trade or with the collapse of the global economies. but in the background, you do measure increases in costs, including cost of money. That's the second big story here. That the central banks, Frankfurt, the Fed, London, have been pumping free, unlimited money into our economies was not something that just happened as a response to COVID. It started a lot before COVID. It started gradually, the famous QE, quantitative easing. What does quantitative easing mean? It means that if you have money, your money is not that valuable because the central bank prints money consistently. And they did this because they saw that the fundamental push in the global economies was not very strong enough. We wanted to support investment. We wanted more investment. And despite all the story about green transition and new energy sources, investment was lagging in Europe. So one thing that we did was we said, okay, what can you do? Money should be free. So we're giving people money to cover their consumption, to cover their investments. Excellent. And then inflation appeared. From 10 years of almost zero, it went to 10%. It started before the energy crisis. It started because we had a lot of money in our pocket. Everybody had tons of money. It was free, remember? But we couldn't go out for 2 years, so we saved this money, and then we started consuming it, and then the Russians got into Ukraine, and this was a trigger for inflation to go from 3, 4, 5% to 10% in Europe, and now we are trying to get the genie back into the bottle. Okay. Here is a country some of us care about. It's called Greece. Greece is what the textbooks call a small open economy. The definition of a small open economy is one that cannot dictate the terms of trade. It's an economy that has to take the terms of trade as givens, and then to see where it can produce, how it should trade. So one thing that we see here is that Greece has been growing recently systematically higher than the average European economy. So this is quarter by quarter. This is real GDP growth. So this is despite inflation. This is not inflation. So despite inflation, we have been growing faster than Europe. Now, part of this is a story about Europe, especially the Europe that depends on Germany. Germany is near zero now. Actually, the last quarter was minus. And then there are a lot of economies that are dependent on Germany. We are not as much. So why is Greece growing so much? It is growing so much because it went down so much during the debt crisis. It went down by 20%. There was no reason, actually, from an economist viewpoint, to go down more than half of that. So as we are catching up in terms of investment and in terms of unemployment reduction, Greece is growing. Then, of course, we recovered much faster after the pandemic because we had the tourism effect. And it's also a country that, it's a long discussion, but the bottom line is that in terms of economic stability, we are doing quite well. I'm sorry, in terms of political stability. Okay, let's scratch a little bit behind the surface. Investment has been growing, but we need a lot more. Now, this is not one story, it's two stories. Corporate investment has actually held its ground quite well the last several years. It decreased, but not as much. It was investment in housing that collapsed. And it is recovering, but slowly. Now, why should I show this graph in a session that's about the global trends and how Greece connects with those? Because domestic savings is not enough to support the investment we need to grow. So we need foreign investment. We need foreign direct investment, but we also need all sorts of investment, portfolio investment. And it is a big question mark to what extent, how fast this can be done. bringing foreign money in. It was easier 2 years ago when this money had zero cost. It's not as easy now when the interest rates go up. The other story is about exports. All right, this is an interesting story which shows that actually even during the crisis years, this is exports of goods, this is not tourism or other services. Greek businesses have been making stuff and selling it to the global markets, a little bit more year after year. That's a very nice story. Greek businesses have been, in the last year that we have this data, exported about 40 billion euros worth of goods, when in 2004, a very good year for the Greek economy, we were only exporting 13 billion euros. So this is a trend that not many people notice, partly because this reflects exporting businesses and foreign markets. But those who are working in these businesses, they're actually making nice incomes. And actually, that's a nice story here. There is a measure that some economists will like to put forward, which is what we call extroversion. So extroversion is not the balance of trade. It's not exports minus imports. It's exports plus imports. So it's how much of this business you do with abroad, because also how it was explained in the previous presentation, imports are not necessarily a bad thing if they help your technology advancement. So Greece is gradually becoming more and more integrated into the European and the global economy. Good. Of course, we are having a trade deficit yet. Okay. Thank you. Money is becoming more expensive, though, as I said. So funding the transition to a new growth model is more challenging today than it would be a few years back. And we lost an opportunity to do this the easy way. And this is the famous current account deficit, which shows, which is a reflection of the competitiveness of the economy. This deficit, this is for over 8 months. So over the whole year, it's going to be about 10 billion euros deficit in the current account. And this is something that should worry us, as well as the fact that when it comes to goods, we do not have that many global brands, and we are more concentrated. That's a nice table that I don't have the time to explain. It's going to be a big mistake for the Greek economy if ahead of the turbulence we see in global markets, it actually retracts into its safety zone rather than open up. It has to open up again and shift capital and labor towards areas where it has a chance to be global champion. Thank you, Vasily.
Thank you, Nico. And in the playful exchange of negative and positive news, this is truly net positive, which is not to be taken for granted for Nikos Vettas presentations. I take trade and technology have made the biggest difference and continue to do so. We will be running out of reserves of energy and low-cost labor in Southeast Asia, but overall global sentiment improves or stays positive. Cost is the big challenge, but extroversion is improving, especially for the Greek economy. So I think this is a net positive message for me. So on this context, I want to ask Nikos Tsafos. Nikos is, as I mentioned, the chief energy advisor to the Greek Prime Minister. I have kindly asked him, because we have the subsequent panel on energy, to focus on geopolitics, and also to step into the EU perspective as we want to get this context as well. And I will also kindly ask him to remain on time for the 15-minute mark. Thank you, Nico.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having me. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about where we are in the arc of the energy crisis, and I want to talk about the future and the energy transition and supply chains. So where we are in the arc of the energy crisis, last year was a massive macroeconomic shock for Europe in terms of energy. Just to give you some figures, Europe spends about 80 billion euros a year to import natural gas. That's sort of the long-term average. Last year, we spent 316, right? So that's the type of increase that we saw, 4x last year, in terms of the shock that we had to absorb, which triggered support for consumers and other things. And even today, we are still living with the consequences of that shock. If you look at aggregate macroeconomic data, you can sort of see it, sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending on the country. If you look at aggregate industrial production data, again, the same thing, maybe you can see it, maybe not. If you look at industrial production and you rank it by energy intensity, it's incredibly visible, where we have lost in energy-intensive sectors like metals and chemicals and wood and paper. We've lost about 10, 15% of production at the European level over the last 2 years. And obviously, and you heard that from the previous speaker, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but energy produced or added to inflationary pressures, which we're still living with today, and it also provoked a response from central banks and higher interest rates, which we are also living with today. So relative to where we were in 2022, we are now going back into a winter. Winter is sort of the more dangerous part of the European energy system today because most of the challenge has been on natural gas. We use a lot more natural gas in winter than we do in summer, and so being able to meet European demand in summer is not difficult. Being able to meet European demand in winter is actually difficult. And so on the price front, relative to the prices that we saw last year, and the price that we saw were, insane, I think is the technical term. Just to give you a sense, because European gas is usually quoted in euros per megawatt, and very few people understand euros per megawatt, but most people understand dollars per barrel. If you convert the gas into oil equivalent terms, last August, the price of gas was about $600 a barrel, right? That was the price that we faced a year ago in late August in Europe. Relative to that, things are much better. We're about 80, 90% down on natural gas. And so we're going into the winter with what most analysts assume or think is a relatively robust balance. We have filled up our storage. We've reduced our demand for natural gas. We've reduced our demand for electricity. We have growth in renewables. We have growth in hydro, which last year did poorly at the European level. We have some recovery from French nuclear. All those things, when you add them together, they paint a relatively improved picture for Europe going to the winter, but it's still a very tight market. And so it is a market that is incredibly jittery. Whenever something happens, price can go up very quickly. And so it is definitely something that continues to be of concern, even though, going into the winter at the European level, things are looking quite positive. However, if you step back, the reality is that we have a structural challenge in Europe, which is that we lost Russian gas, and we have replaced this Russian gas, indeed. We paid a lot more for it last year. We're still paying more for it than we were paying for Russian gas years ago. But we also mostly bought this gas in the open market. To put it simply, we bought it cargo by cargo. And there is no guarantee that this gas will continue to come to Europe. And even if we have a very successful energy transition, we're going to be short on gas as Europe for the next 10 to 15 years, right? And so this doesn't mean that these prices will persist for 10 or 15 years. It means that for the next 10 to 15 years, we need to be pulling in significant volumes of gas from the rest of the world. And at this moment, we're essentially very exposed to what happens to the rest of the world because very little of this gas is committed to come to Europe. So that, from a structural perspective, is, I think, the biggest challenge that we face in energy markets is the overall tightness, but also the fact that as Europe, I'm not talking about Greece, but as Europe, we are highly exposed to those international dynamics, and small shifts in that environment could have big impacts in terms of the price that we pay for energy. Let me now switch to talk a little bit more about climate policy. And I think what you've seen over the last year, year and a half, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, is essentially the fusion, the merging of climate policy, industrial policy, and trade policy. Put very simply, there is very little climate policy left in the world that is primarily or purely about climate. It is about resilience, it is about economics, it is about economic security, it's about jobs, it's about value chains and supply chains, in addition to being about reducing emissions. And the reality that we face is that if you look at these supply chains, the supply chains not for the goods that we're consuming now, but also of the goods whose importance we know is going to grow over the next 10, 15 years. What is very clear is that if you look at a map of supply chains, across the board you see a lot of red, right? These are supply chains where China has a very prominent role. In some places, the role is essentially dominant, like solar photovoltaics and the early stages of battery production. In other areas, it's just very big, like wind, and obviously in electric vehicles, right? So the reality is that the technologies that we have scaled to address climate over the last decade, decade and a half, the value chains for those supply chains have very much grown and matured in China. Now, and this is something a little bit more on the positive side of things. If you look at the world ex-China, actually Europe has a much stronger industrial position in these products than the United States. If you look at electric vehicles, if you look at wind, if you look at hydrogen, electrolyzer production, which we use for hydrogen production, Europe actually tends to have a much greater presence in those markets than the United States. So in some ways, one could look at efforts like the Inflation Reduction Act as an attempt to not just sort of compete with China, which is the obvious thing, but also in practical terms, in some ways, catch up to the European lead in some of these markets. It's definitely true, clearly, for electric vehicles. In offshore wind, Europe is far, far ahead of where the United States is today. And so I think it's quite important in thinking about the European response, not to be sort of reductionist and nihilistic and think everything's in China and now everything's going to be in America, because the reality is that over the last 10, 15 years, yes, a huge part of these supply chains have been built in China, but at the same time, Europe actually has managed in certain sectors to maintain a very strong foothold and certainly greater than what the United States has been able to do in that same period of time. And I think the real challenge that we face is when you think about industrial policy, you basically have two broad risks. You can waste a lot of money in supporting firms, and you can also, in supporting firms, sort of move away from the principles of trade and lose out on all the benefits that the two previous speakers sort of talked about. And in certain ways, what we've seen, if you think of the three main economic poles of the world, the United States, Europe, and China, we've seen both of the other two economic poles sort of engage in climate policy that has some of these features, right? Very generous support, in some ways not necessarily sort of with a cost-benefit framework, but more in terms of wanting to create supply chains and jobs, even if you sort of spend a lot of money in the process, and also support in ways that may not follow the rule book of the WTO. And so what we have, I think, in Europe is, if you look on the one hand at the track record that I talked about, I think there's something to be said about that slightly more cautious European approach of wanting to support, but being mindful of not overdoing it, keeping an eye out on the internal market and making sure that you don't have countries that have additional fiscal space being able to support way more than countries that don't have equivalent fiscal space, but also being mindful of creating industrial policy that is not about sort of closing your market and trying to sever your ties with the rest of the world, which if we did that, realistically speaking, for climate at least, it would be quite challenging since so many of these value chains are globally integrated and also depend on China. I mean, if you look at Chinese electric vehicle exports, more than half of them are manufactured by US and European companies, right? So yes, they're Chinese exports, but they're Chinese exports by sort of Western firms, right? So that interconnectedness has been a key part of how we've been able to build up scale and how we've been able to bring down the cost of these technologies. And so I think as we think about the future and the position of Europe, I think there's something to be said about that slightly more balanced approach that Europe is taking to supply chains. So just to wrap up, on the energy front, huge shock, still living with the consequences. Things are looking so much better relative to where they were last year, feeling very good about where we are in the winter, but we still have a structural disadvantage based on our exposure in the international market for natural gas. And on the climate side of things, in this world where climate and industrial policy and trade policy are fusing together, and I think you're seeing countries sort of do climate policy primarily through the lens of industrial policy and trade policy. I think there's something to be said about a European approach that tries to maintain a balance between these different objectives and doesn't just go sort of all in on one direction. And in fact, the track record of the last decade, I think, shows that there's wisdom in that approach. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nico, for the timeliness, but also for the both realistic but also net positive tone. On one hand, as you mentioned, jittery energy markets, but it feels that we are going into a 23-24 winter without the fears of the previous winter. And I truly appreciated both the analysis and the insight on climate policy around the advances of technology allowing us to deal with the climate challenge, about strengths of the EU versus the US in these technological fronts. And in fact, a lot of what we are looking at as challenges from the US, like the IRA being a policy to catch up for the US with the EU, and also the right perspective around European industrial policy, bringing a balanced perspective around supporting, but also keeping the mind on the internal market as well. So I could not be more blessed than having EU, Greek, and also the global perspective, because that's what Anders offered around the need for global trade. And I would like to kick off the discussion, and there I'm taking poetic license, inspired by the poetry anniversary, among other things. It's the 60th year of the first Nobel Prize for Greece, so I'm taking poetic license in economics. I don't know if this can be done, but the three themes that I'm picking, probably not. The three themes that I'm picking is, first of all, the Ukraine war, and what it has meant from your perspectives. The second one is around the China-West decoupling, and the third one is around the climate crisis. On the Ukraine war, I would like to start by asking Anders on whether Sweden's entry into NATO has had an aftermath and implications on the Swedish economy, on the trade flows, and also to reflect on the recent developments in the Middle East, to what extent there is impact that one can see on the global economy, but also specifically for Sweden.
Thank you very much. It's evident that the horrible war in Ukraine, the Russian atrocities there, have changed the outlook for Swedish trade and Swedish security policy. And the most important change, of course, is our application to become a member of NATO, which in turn will no doubt change parts of our economic structure, not least making it even maybe easier for our arms industry to cooperate with colleagues within the NATO structure. The way our society is also now organizing, we are not only scaling up our military defense, we are also scaling up our civil defense, which of course will affect companies as well, since for many years the planning for how to run our economy in crisis, or if worse comes to worse, in war, have been falling behind, and we are coming back there as well. My agency is handling the National Board of Trade. We are handling many aspects of the EU sanctions against Russia since the outbreak of the war. We have been used to try to open up markets. Now we have to be good in isolating markets, isolating the Russian economy in order to make sure that the country will find it difficult to continue to wage this awful war. And we are doing that in various ways, including by looking at how the sanctions, unfortunately, are also circumvented to some extent. The conflict in the Middle East, of course, will also be affecting economic integration, trade. Our trade figures with the countries involved aren't that large, so the immediate effect will not be, for that reason, very large. But the effects that can follow from this on energy prices and what have you, of course, can also create challenges for our country.
Thank you, Anders. And Nico, if I turn to Greece and impact of Ukraine war and also expected impact from the Middle East crisis.
I have no idea. But there is one thing that doesn't help the Greek economy, which is increased uncertainty globally and in our area. And in that vein, this is not good for Greece. But the direct impact thus far has not been large.
From Middle East?
Neither from the Ukraine war, given the European response. The indirect impact can be severe if you think if you think down a list of things. So
energy.
Here are some scattered thoughts, and apologies if I end up being a little bit undiplomatic in some of those. Okay, first thought is that when I'm thinking about the Ukraine war, is that Germans make mistakes too. And we as Greeks, or we as European Union, we cannot just rely on Germany doing whatever it does and then us following. It's clear that Germany made a mistake in terms of the energy policy. It made a sequence of mistakes after the first mistake, which was the dependence on Russia, including Anyway, it made a sequence of mistakes. So this means that we as the Greek economy and the Greek energy policy, we have to also think for ourselves. That's one thing. The second thing is a little bit sad, which is that is more on the society side, which that's something as terrible may be happening next door, and eventually that we get used to it. And we may not even care as much about how this is going to end. It doesn't affect the everyday's life, other than high energy costs. We got used to the fact that this is happening over there. Third thing that even I don't know how to handle is about institutions and what I'm looking around the global map, and I see a lot of large powers that in my book, they are nowhere near what I would call a democracy. And that's a lot. And this is not shrinking, it's growing. Certainly it's growing in terms of GDP of the world. And I have no idea how to handle this. Because we as democracies, if we are getting a smaller share of the global GDP, we also have more of a difficult time to plan transitions, including green transitions. Because if you're not in a democratic regime, you don't care about elections. You can actually dictate how things are going to be, directly or indirectly, in a few years. And we have elected governments, and we have governments that they have to go to the people, especially at a time of high cost and decreasing incomes, and tell them that maybe you have to do this because in 5 or 10 years it's important that you do this today. These are complicated tricks. And my fourth thought...
I've noted 6 so far, but maybe...
My seventh thought is about dependence, which comes to trade, right? And you also, of course, mentioned this. Do you want to do the green transition thing if you are relying on somebody that you don't want to be relying on them, whether this is solar panels or this is batteries or rare earths? As we speak, I don't know if it is 93 or 96% of global production of microchips that happens to be in one country, and this country is not necessarily safe. So how you plan ahead when you have these risks, and how are we willing to trade democratic values and institutions relative to high cost, relative to low costs? So the Ukraine, of course, the Middle East crisis is a different one, and it comes from a different source. But I have a lot of questions ahead, so I don't know if this helped, but I'm going to stop before you count.
Tremendously and not diplomatic, and the best way to pivot to Nikos, and I understand you have to be diplomatic because you have an official role other than leading Greece's preeminent economic think tank. But, first of all, do you agree? Just to sum up, there was a strategic pitfall, to put it mildly, from Germany to rely excessively for themselves and for the rest of Europe on Russian gas. Societal second and third order effects of getting used to having a war in the continent. The fact that democracy is certainly facing challenges in many parts of the world. And then the fact that we don't, especially for our part of the world, the blessing that we have of being in democratic societies is countered by the fact that election cycles need to be taken into account when you plan for things that do have economic and political cost in the short term, like green transition, and also the over-reliance, dependence rather, of green transition on a value chain that certainly has some parts that are not so secure. So views on that, but I would also ask you your lessons from what we have lived through, especially from the Ukraine war, and what are the lessons learned for Greece and Europe more broadly and beyond the very nice provoking thoughts of Nikos. Vettas.
Okay, that's way too much. And I've written a lot of things before I took this job that you can read on some of these questions, so I'm definitely going to avoid them given my current job. But I will say a few things in response. And it goes a little bit on the risk assessment and how we think about risk, but also what the things that we learned from the war and the impact on the energy market in Greece. I talked before about the European numbers, which was 80 billion, 316 billion on the imports of natural gas. In Greece, the equivalent numbers was 1 billion and 7 billion. 7x was the cost of natural gas for Greece last year. And the reason I refer to this number, and the Prime Minister does as well, is because first it shows the scale of what we faced last year, but it also helps you think very clearly about what it means to not have an insurance policy, right? It tells you, when you try to think, oh, should I do this, should I do that, should I protect myself, should I become more resilient, should I diversify? You have a very clear number of what it means not to do that. And by the way, we were highly diversified, way more diversified than most parts of Europe, but we were still exposed on the pricing front by what happened in this conflict. Right. So for me, when I look at this number, and then I think we have incredible sun and wind potential, and the world is switching to resources that we have in abundance in Greece, I think of the energy transition as an incredible opportunity, right? Because last year I spent more than 7 billion euros importing natural gas, and I don't have hydrocarbons. Maybe I do. We're looking. I may give a different talk in a few years, but right now we don't know if we have, but we definitely have solar and wind potential in Greece. And so one of our lessons was, let's try to move to the world that uses the energy that we have. Does that create dependencies and complexities? Absolutely. I would, if I put on my previous hat, which was looking at supply chains for a living, the dependence of a Chinese solar panel is not the same as the dependence on Russian gas, because if China decides to stop exporting solar panels, the solar panel on my rooftop is still going to be producing energy. So it has a different effect because we're not sort of consuming these products, we're using them for capital investments. And so we need to think a little bit differently about our exposure, how much we're willing to pay for resilience and for diversification, and to have those be driven sort of by what the data shows us. The last thing I'll say in terms of lessons that we've learned from last year, I think one of the most important ones that we learned was that when the crisis hits, there's only so much you can do to change the world in the next 6 months. Right? So I started this job last summer. And when you get together in the summer to figure out how you're going to make it through the winter, there's only so much you can do. And as a country, we were actually blessed because for the last 20 years, we had made a number of choices that put last year's policymakers in a relatively good position. We had diversified our sources, we had access to LNG, we were able to sort of reconfigure our system. And our main challenge last year was not access to physical supply, which was a problem for a lot of other countries. It was essentially the triangle of we wanted to support consumers, and we did. We also wanted demand to fall because we didn't want to support consumers so much that people consumed as if there was no crisis. We accomplished that. We had 1.5 times greater reduction in gas use, 2 times the reduction in electricity use. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't derail the finances of the country. And actually, if you look at the record, I think, of the government last year, it managed to navigate those three sort of core constraints and objectives relatively well. And of course, we wouldn't have been able to do that if we weren't in a broader context of economic expansion, which we were. It would have been impossible to do that. So that's just some of the reflections that I would give on the questions that you asked.
Thank you, Nico. Let me move to the second theme, China versus West decoupling. And I will start again with Anders around Sweden's impact on this increasing decoupling, if you agree, because we heard you are the fourth most globalized economy, and the numbers spoke for themselves from the stats that the ambassador showed. So maybe we will be positively surprised again, but it would be interesting to hear your perspective as a heavily industrial economy versus China.
Well, thank you. It is, of course, a question that is key not only to Sweden but to the globe as such. And again, looking back a little bit, in the 1990s and thereafter, I spent endless hours in meetings in Geneva on China's accession to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization. It took 15 years to negotiate the terms for China's accession to the WTO in 2001. And then, of course, many of us thought that this would lead to easier and better relations with China, and that China maybe even would change by being integrated in the global system. And we were wrong, that's evident. And now we have to learn the lesson from that. Looking at it from a Swedish perspective, I think decoupling, and your company representatives know more about that than me, has already taken place, is taking place in terms of digital outlets, internet connections where separate nets are set up for Chinese operations and other operations. Apart from that, and also, of course, there is no room for naivety in terms of relations with China when security is really at risk, as it might be in telecommunications and some other areas. But apart from that, I think looking at it from a Swedish perspective, de-risking is the main kind of theme. Again, companies themselves have to decide how to de-risk, how to change supply chains if needed. What is important, I think, is that this is not done in a way so that legitimate trade opportunities, legitimate opportunities to be a partner with Chinese companies are eliminated, because we have to engage continuously with even a country like China. The second aspect, after de-risking, I think that is important for Sweden, is that as a country we have to move ahead in partnership. Of course, the EU being our main conduit in this regard, but also partnership between the EU and the US. That's important, even if the EU, I think, should not just rubber stamp what the Americans does, what the Americans do, because we might need a different path in our relation with China than what is presently the outlook from Washington. And thirdly, from a Swedish point of view, it will be very important to keep the European Union strong, so that the European Union economically can take up the challenge that China is putting forward for us. And in that respect, again, I think in this security architecture of ours, I would strongly argue that the missing link in the present-day Western security architecture is a transatlantic free trade area, which would make both the American and the European economy stronger, and that would be one way of keeping China at bay. Unfortunately, this is a dead end in Washington presently, but I think it's important to keep the idea in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Nico, when we look at the Greek economy impact from the West versus China decoupling, maybe the way to position the question is, I would say we were quite proud in Greece about the relationship with China, in a way that there was a strategic investment with Costco in the port of Piraeus. There were some other strategic investments, and overall what seemed to be a balanced relationship that was developing. Now it seems this is coming under question. We see a pivot to India. Of course, it's very early days. How do you see the impact of this China versus West decoupling on the Greek economy and other alternatives that might be emerging?
My own view about how Greece can grow and prosper over the next decade or 2 decades is that it can only do this if it opens up more. And this has actually happened, if we have historians in the audience, this has happened over the centuries, whenever Greece tried, whatever Greece meant, when it tried to become like a small closed system, then it suffered. When you open up, and open up means trade, it means people, it means ideas, then you prospered. And looking ahead, that's the way I also envision Greece, like a hub in southeastern Mediterranean that is going to connect a lot of that. Now, in that vein, Greece can only lose if there is more tension between Europe and China, or the Western world and China. Having said that, there is a lot of soul searching that we have to do. The level of investment that China has made in Greece so far is it was important at the time, but it's not something huge. The bigger question, and a lot of points that Anders made were excellent, is how we view the rules for global trade. And there is a very, very specific and difficult moment, which is, would we like to promote trade per se with China or whoever, because trade is a good thing, period? Or should we try to make more and more a precondition for trade, what sort of institutions the other party has, how far ahead they are in the green transition, and so on and so forth. These are probably, the real world is going to be somewhere in the middle. However, it will most probably be a mistake to wait for China or for whoever to fully respond to what we would like them to be before we trade more to them. But that's a difficult discussion for sure, and one that is ongoing. Let me put one more word on this table. It wasn't in your question, but it was implicit in your question. It's a continent called Africa. The relations between Europe and China have much to do about Africa. China has invested massively. It directly or indirectly controls a lot of the production base of and institutions in Africa. It would be absolutely, it would be a strategic mistake for Europe not to realize what it can gain from promoting in a mutually beneficial way relations with Africa and leaving Africa elsewhere.
Wow, great thoughts. Again, the premise usually is let's trade more and then democracy will come, and we haven't seen that happening with China. So what you are saying, let's see what they are about, especially on the green front, before we trade more. I think that's a very pragmatic approach. Nico, if I move to you on the trade, on the hub paradigm, on what has made Greece great over history, the openness. How do you see the developments as a policy advisor, and what could this mean on this vision of the hub, which I know the government and the Prime Minister has shared very openly and very frequently?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of three layers here. One is, I mean, the idea of the hub, if we don't just focus this on China, but just on new trade flows, and especially on energy, I mean, I sometimes oversimplify by saying that the energy system, particularly the gas system, but also the oil system, has essentially, the center of gravity has gone from the hinterland to the coast, right? Because we used to import energy from West Siberia into Central Europe, and now it's switched. So for Greece, it used to be at the end of the line, and now you're on the front of the line. So that creates great opportunities for us to use our geographical position to supply energy inland, and we're doing this successfully. On a second level, though, you know, we are a small country that is essentially a price taker, and you know, we've seen, if you look at the cost of solar in Greece last year, it was one of the highest increases worldwide. If you look at offshore wind, which is one of our top priorities for this next four-year administration, you know, we're seeing projects around the world struggling to deliver at the cost that they had agreed to because of supply chain pressure. And the reality is that for a lot of the things that we want to do, China is an indispensable part of the supply chains, whether because they have the whole thing or whether because they supply the components. And so from that perspective, tension means higher cost, and if you're trying to deploy capital, higher cost means you can do less with the same capital. So from that perspective, it has an adverse effect on Greece. Thirdly, though, is Greece has a robust, not huge, but robust industrial base when it comes to clean energy. We have aluminum, we have cement, we have copper, we produce cables, we produce pipelines for CO2 and for gas and for hydrogen. We make batteries. And so any dynamic that supports European industry, and it doesn't have to be moving away from free trade and putting trade barriers, but it means trying to figure out the barriers that European industry faces and trying to address those barriers, you know, creates opportunities for us because we can be suppliers to the world, right? And so we have certain companies that are really internationally cutting edge, and they will benefit from a more sort of industry supportive European policy. To give a very narrow example, this has been in the press, you know, we have gallium, where we are trying to position ourselves as one of the countries that could replace the gallium that is lost from the Chinese decision to reduce exports, right? So, you know, this realignment of supply chains creates openings for people that have a presence to expand their presence. And so that is why we are a very sort of keen participant in the European conversations on a number of initiatives around supply chains, the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act. Now we're talking about the Wind Act. You know, all these things are how do we support European industry? And so we are, as a country, we can benefit immensely from that because it's not just about the deployment of these technologies, but it's also about the manufacturing. And in certain areas, we are present.
Nico, thanks a lot. Maria, do we have time, because it shows here I'm in the red, but do we have time for questions from the audience, or are we?
No, actually, I think it's we need to stop here.
Okay, so if I can sum up, just 1 minute.
Thank you.
First of all, I said in the beginning I feel blessed with this panel. I repeat that because I think there is great perspective that came from all three of you, and I really appreciate it. I've just made some key points that despite the fact that we are talking about geopolitical disruptions and the focus was economic impact, let's not underestimate the social impact and what war in the region and so close to us in our continent, but also very close by, means for society. The fact that democracy should not be taken for granted, and we are actually exposed to many countries in the global trade, in geopolitics, in Greece especially, but also beyond, where democracy is not at the level that we are enjoying in the EU. Thirdly, clear support for more trade, but I also take the need for greener trade, the way that we defined how we can think about the future with China. Anders redefined or added a new definition of NATO. It's not only North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but you want also trade organization, right? I mean, that's what US, EU freer trade is all about, which I think is a fantastic idea. And the last two thoughts is around the more supportive industrial policy for the cutting-edge sectors for Europe, but also for Greece, and how meaningful this can be. So a bit more activist, maybe learning from the US, but in a different way, in a more proactive way. And I will close with this beautiful idea of Greece, which has thrived in the past, and I think Sweden has done so as well. It is actually, it has had much more continuity on that, when it has been a hub of extrovertedness, trade, investment, and all the good things that come with it. So with this I close. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion and for listening.
Thank you so much for a very insightful discussion on a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities as well. So I believe that now we could all use